Mr. Valo, you're a businessman. How did you get involved with the issues around flooding? The town of Perečín, where our company is based, gets its water from wells which are replenished from the nearby river Úh in the process of gravel filtration. In the early spring of 2009, the local city council representatives would come again and again and ask us to lay a gravel deposit transverse to the river's flow, which would raise the river's level and fill up the wells. As early as May, I started wondering why the river continuously lacks water. My initial reasoning was that this area takes in the same amount of rain as 10, 20, or 50 years ago, with one difference. Now the water is lacking. It didn't take long, and the pieces started falling into place. In 2007 and 2008, I was working in a forest road building team. We made 53 kilometers of roads throughout the Carpathian Ruthenia from early spring to the last days of the year. I was managing the works for the whole 2 years, sometimes staying on the job for as many as 3 months at a time. In the course of the 2 years, I experienced long-time rains and downpours. I noticed how the rainwater drains away downwards. When I wanted to get to the building team that was working up the slope as it was raining, it was impossible to reach them via forest roads because they were filled with runoff that was carrying stones, tree branches, even woodlogs. A meter-high deluge. The runoff was as high as the road was deep. It was just as impossible to get up there when I tried to climb up using the heavy machinery or tractor tracks. But when I ranged through clearings where logs were roped or the forest, there was a complete absence of a runoff. I also noticed that when we used the access roads to build slope roads, it was the former which would channel so much water it seemed to have almost a rainfall intensity. In 2009, as I was working on the Úh River problem, my experience with the runoff during the forest road building in 2007 throughout 2008 came racing back to me. Mr. Valo, what prompted you to engage in initiatives which address these issues? I realized why we lack water, how it drains away from the mountains and it isn't absorbed by the soil, and consequently does not feed into rivers. For this reason, I started reading up more about it and watching programs on lack of water. I noticed that neither the TV programs nor pertinent magazines or scientific information specified the root cause of lack of water or flooding. They were all too generic. They said, there's too much wood logging, it's the forest that has gone awry. In reality, the forest is not to blame for flooding. Even the forest clearing isn't detrimental in this respect, as long as heavy machinery tracks aren't left behind or road isn't built. To explain, the rainfall does not drain away the forest soil, because when it falls, it is readily absorbed. But where we've made a track, or even slightly compacted the soil by, let's say, 1-ton off-road car, the precipitation is no longer absorbed, but rather drains away along the pathways. When I realized that no one else was recognizing this fact, I thought I had to bring this piece of knowledge to relevant companies to, so to speak, open their eyes and point them in the direction of this issue. In early 2010, I met with representatives from Forza, a Swiss and Ukrainian company, who heard me out, but did not really place too much significance on it. Just a few days later, however, they called me again and invited me to a 2-day seminar in Hust, where I talked about the same thing I told them initially. I took the floor and told them, all of us sitting here are drowning ourselves out. Are we aware of that? The rainfall does not drain away from the forest, but via forest roads. At the end of the day, we're struggling to brace down in the valleys with the mess we create up in the forest. I'm talking about those who are in charge of elaborating methodology of forest roads, those who built them and those who manage them. We create a situation and then drown ourselves out. Everybody was quiet. I listed the root causes, forest and access roads and heavy machinery tracks, and proposed possible solutions, such as to recultivate the forest and access roads and heavy machinery tracks. If we don't dig over the compacted soil, water will just slide on top of it even years after the use of the road has been discontinued. They asked me what the Austrians would be doing in the process of recultivating forest roads with side ditches. I told them they would be covering them up with fresh soil. There's nothing else to it. I have also approached a Slovak organization named People and Water, where I met Mr. Kraučík, who too engages in climate and water initiatives. On February 25, 2010, I was given a 7-minute time slot to speak at a seminar this organization held, and ended discussing the issue for a whole hour. At first, they were not sure what I was trying to convey to them, but when it was over, 15 to 20 people came back to me, wanted to shake my hand, and were in a state of disbelief that they did not notice what I did. Later, I found out about another conference, and to be precise, I will read its official title out to you. It was the 27th meeting of the European Forestry Commission, namely the Working Group, which addressed issues concerning water management in mountain systems. There were delegations from different countries: Germany, Poland, France, even Japan. The Polish team presented a paper which recounted how they observed a stream in the Tatra Mountains, which keeps losing water year after year. They showed a photo which made it clear that they log wood exactly the same way as we do in Slovakia and Ukraine, namely that they all drag the logwood in a perpendicular fashion and leave tracks behind in the clearings. When it rains, the rainfall above the river flows directly into it, increasing the level dramatically in just a few hours. Since it could not percolate into the soil, which would replenish it throughout the year, but it was drained away into the river, and the water level kept falling with the increasing number of access roads and heavy machinery tracks. There were 3 comments raised when the presentation finished, but nobody told them that there were too many tracks in the soil, which caused the water to drain away too quickly instead of being absorbed slowly. Nobody. They were supposed to be dealing with this. I had no right to present, so I was suffering and quiet under this poster, thinking to myself, the floods will come to Slovakia one day, and I could then convince them that I was right. About 2 weeks later, the first flood occurred in Hnúšťa, then Ľubica, Kežmarok, with huge flooding, and Dukla. I would go there immediately when they occurred and focus on where the water was coming from. That is how the previous excerpts were made, and consequently the documentary was shot by Mr. Majerčík. We started out in Ľubica, where he was filming all the horror, as I was saying to him, you know, this is all it happens, and it starts with the forest roads. He protested, saying, Mr. Valo, these are only your conjectures. If I have the need to make them published, then I will. But until then, I need to film the devastation. So he shot all the mess the water carried into town, the roots, the stones, and the flooded houses and fields. When we then checked the forest upstream, it was nice and clean, and the paths, these were Slovak roads, not Ukrainian ones, were eroded to the stone base. I said to him, this is how it starts, and where the water comes rushing in. This is how the first shots of film you saw came about. I took him up to the location where I used the pickaxe and poured water in. I showed him how much more water the soil was able to still absorb. As we were leaving, he said, But, Mr. Valo, nobody talks about this at all. We have to do something about it. We must film a documentary and point out that the water does not stream down from the forest's non-compacted areas as opposed to the ubiquitously presented cause of clearing forests. Mr. Valo, did the Slovak government react to your contribution at the meetings, conferences, or the documentary and the message it conveyed? We presented the documentary in part at the governmental session in Košice on August 27th. It was a 10-minute excerpt. We also provided the brochures, which I submitted for the second time. They acknowledged the message and agreed that measures would be taken to really prevent flooding and not just focus on building levees and polders.
Boj proti povodňam, má sa robiť nejaká prevencia a nestavanie tých hrádz a tých všelijakých poldrov. 27. októbra
On October 27th, the Slovak government accepted a document that specified the steps that should be taken, and it also appointed a mandatory for floods. It should initiate a cycle which would prevent further extension of this type of forest roads and cover forest recultivation and so forth. The Slovak government has adopted the measures concentrating on the floods, yet you keep pushing and stay active in this initiative. Why? I sent an extract to the Slovak Government Office, Ministry of Transport and Ministry of Finance from the directives the forestry departments of Slovakia follow, and which specify how they should be doing proper housekeeping in the forests and how to recultivate forest roads. I highlighted which regulations are being violated and what needs to be done. I received a thank you letter from Ms. Prime Minister where she expressed gratitude for sharing my experience, which the government put into practice in the future for sure. That was all. But when I climbed over Uble yesterday, I made this photo of a clearing, which was logged after the government paper was adopted. There are new roads with drain ditches, which bring the water down too quickly first thing in the spring. The clearing above Ubljanka River shows forest access roads, which are used to transfer logwood down. When we take a closer look, we see the log trunks and the tracks, which will channel water as it starts trickling down with everything that the tracks contain. Here you see a forest road with chopped branches, which are only waiting for a bit of rain to fall to flush them into this creek, which might flood the Ubla River.
A potom táto, a ešte tu celkom nad riekou Ubľankou, poďte sa, už tu je lesná cesta, tu končí a tu je to všetko, čaká na to, že príde väčší dáždik, to všetko zmete do tejto riečky. Táto riečka možno nám zatopí Ubľu, potom táto riečka s týmto neporiadkom.
The river would cross the Slovak-Ukrainian border and might flood Berezne. Fully loaded, it crosses the entire Ukraine through the region of Berezne and Užhorod, which is filled with dams that would prevent the flooding. On the Slovak side, however, it could flood, let's say, Palovce nad Uhom, before it enters Hungary, where it can keep wreaking havoc. So these roads are being built despite the fact the Slovak government has adopted the document to do otherwise. The EU allocates financial resources to address this challenge. Do you know how this money translates into projects? At the beginning of 2010, the director of Forest Management Plant has approached me to assist in a joint project between Slovakia and Ukraine with an allocated budget of 2 million euros. He invited me to supervise the works that would be done. I worked in the Ukrainian team in the Slovak plant in Sobrance, in a forest management plant. 800,000 would go towards the Ukrainian activities and the remaining 1.2 million would be used in Slovakia. In Ukraine, we were supposed to reconstruct 8 kilometers of roads and 8 bridges and restore the asphalt. The Slovak working group was renovating a 6-kilometer stretch. When I checked the asphalt and found out it was undefective, I asked the Slovak team what they would be doing instead. They said they would put a new layer of asphalt and perform a new modification, and it should be fine. So the Slovak team received 1.2 million to work on a 6-kilometer road in a great shape. They could lay new asphalt for about 400,000 euros, and the rest would go towards the SAF project. I'm not sure what exactly those were. I think the money could be used more effectively to build works which are critical for retaining water and keeping the natural balance in place. In the Ukrainian project, we were told only 400,000 were earmarked for road renovation material and works. The rest would again go towards the SAF project. Considering the length and the scope of the works, 400,000 was insufficient. To wrap up, I think that these projects need better management to increase efficient use of the EU funds when the corrective and preventative measures concerning forest roads are put in place. Mr. Valo, you have been, so to speak, ferrying the floodwaters for a few years now. Have you delved into issues concerning global warming and the greenhouse effect? The connection occurred to me about 2 weeks ago when we experienced fogs of such magnitude, which I last saw about 20 years ago. It was a nightmare to drive on business trips in winter months. We did not realize the fogs receded after time, and only now they are reappearing. I spoke to Mr. Kravčík about it, and I asked him to explain what the global warming and the greenhouse effect really were. I read up on it as well. He showed me a diagram published by an international climate change panel and said rapid warming of the Earth started in about 1975, when its curve started picking up dramatically. At this point, I realized what the life was like back when I was 25. The air was full of moisture, which would turn into fogs, preventing decent driving. Driving at night was virtually impossible. There were plenty of clouds, dew in the morning, rainfall which secured plenty of water in the rivers in 1975. Ditches along the fields retained water when the rain fell. There was more evaporation going on. The red arrows point to the spots affected by higher warming. Overall, there are fewer areas exposed to overheating. We only see a single red arrow in the forest where the roads are.
Na spodnom obrázku, keď sa pozrieme na spodný obrázok, v jakej situácii sa nachádza krajina dneska.
If you look into the picture below to see the situation change after 1975, there are more forest access roads with about 20 to 30% of compacted soil in Slovakia from tractors, jeeps and trucks.
Tu sa ohrieva krajina.
Landscape is commonly overheated. The field ditches are replaced by communications. The evaporation factor has decreased, and river levels are falling. The rivers are not being replenished because the forests are drained and the water is channeled directly into rivers and out into the sea. The surface area exposed to sunlight and overheating keeps growing. On the other side of the spectrum, the ocean level keeps rising each year by approximately 2 to 3 millimeters. The water from the landscape has been lost to them. It is common sense to know how a regular greenhouse works. We have greenhouse gases in the clouds, and in between, sunlight shines straight through and overheats the land surface. We've drained it, dehydrated it, and allowed the sunlight to boldly overheat it in the end. If there were clouds in its way, they would absorb and diffuse its impact. Water absorbs the heat and evaporates in the water cycle. I would like to entreat all the scientists to notice we are lacking the HO2 greenhouse gas. To speak figuratively, our big greenhouse we live in will dry up soon because it is already experiencing serious water shortages. Again, I appeal to the scientists and politicians to start focusing their attention to this issue. All we really need is a bit of common sense to compare the two pictures. The first one, where the sunlight is diffused by a multitude of natural filters, and the picture below. Immediately your mind starts racing, as you realize what the consequences would be if we don't retain the surface water locally. There are solutions. There really are.
Pán Vajlo, hovoríte o vode, ktorá stieka vlastne z lesov, z hôr.
Mr. Vajlo, you talk about water streaming down from the forest, simply draining away. What can be done to retain it in the forest and in the local sources? Again, I can refer you to the brochure we've written to read the measures I've suggested. When we worked in the forest building project in the Carpathian Ruthenia in 2007, we've created lakes because there were 4 streams springing in the area, which would simply just drain away and erode the landscape. We've built an organic levee here, and 4 years ago now, the ground has shaped itself naturally. At that time, I knew nothing about floods or climate change. In 2009, when I realized how we drain and dehydrate the ground, I built a lake system around our company on 3 hectares of land. In 2010, we've completed the 4th lake, which is also 3 hectares large. During the summer heats, you could observe the evaporation and replenishment of the lake working its way through the water cycle. In 2010, the lake level remained stable. The reservoirs taken about 60 million liters of water. We've also started building water-retaining lakes below a recreational facility in this region, which can hold 20 million liters of rainwater from the surface area of 5 hectares. In the forest above, we are building small levees, 8 all in all, which can hold about 4 million liters of water. These are basically pilot projects aimed to prove these measures work. This recreational facility currently is short of water. I'm convinced that next spring, these ditches will fill up with water from the melting snow, and it won't flood the villages and the people who live here. Instead, it will be retained as an asset in the district of Užhorod.